Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad.
And greetings, I am Nate, and today we are talking about really big swords.
Giant swords. I love giant swords. And here are some of the props that we have made over the years here on Shadowversity. And oh my gosh, I forgot.
Yeah, it's off frame.
How big the Sephiroth sword is. Look at this thing. This thing is insane.
Yeah.
It's immense. It's got a curve in it.
Yeah, it's got a curve in it now because I think
But
it's
look at that. This is a big sword.
It's like an odachi.
So, this is the thing, right? Some of these swords, though, aren't actually that far out of the realms of possibility.
Like that. Way too chunky. Way
too chunky, but in terms
overall,
of length,
that's good.
There were some one-handed swords that got pretty long. I think rapier is about that length, right? And some of them also got similar height as well.
Yes, there are swords that, well, within history, there are swords that can get to that length, though they're not common.
There are actually swords that do get that big, but they're more the exception.
Yes.
And that's kind of what we want to talk about. Like, all right, we love the big giant swords, and we really do. We've even got projects where we're trying to develop and make some, okay? But let's talk about the actual big swords from history, as you see here. And I want to just go through the more common giant swords in a more succinct video that people might not be aware of, or they might be aware of.
Which one do you want to start with?
Well, we'll go with small going up.
Okay.
So
maybe the Claymore. Now, there's a couple of different types of Claymore. One of them is a bigger sword. So do we want to start with that?
Yes. Well, first, Claymore is an odd term. It actually originally applied to the one-handed Scottish basket broadsword.
Yes.
Yes. But then through evolution and language, it's now referring to a much bigger sword. Claymores actually don't always come this big. We have a more stereotypical kind of standard Claymore here.
Yes.
And you notice how it's shorter than these other ones?
By a little.
By a little, okay? Now, Claymores can come a little bit shorter, a little bit longer. The one we have here, we've tested out. This one isn't a great one. It's, but that's more just an individual, how this one was made.
So what you're saying is it's not a great sword?
It's not a great sword. But you can get some really, really good Claymores. Now, this category, is fairly represented in history, okay? Yes. Yet it's not as big as certain, great swords, but they are clearly bigger than many long swords, and so that's why more popular, more modern is warsword. Warsword is an interesting term because it does kind of appear some points in history, there's a sword that is identified as the Great Sword of War, and the thing about that sword, it's actually not huge. It's actually about this size, even a bit shorter. It's just thick. Yeah. It's a thick boy and a chopper. Yeah. It's actually about the length of a longsword. It's just not your stereotypical longsword. And so they identify that's a big war sword. That's a war sword. It's a sword meant for war, and it's pretty great. So it's the Great Sword of War. It's the
great sword. It's the war sword. It's the yes.
Yes.
And they all sit roughly, and it's a very modern category. I think of which you definitely helped to popularise.
Thank you.
Is these sort of ranged swords. Now we're a little under 6 foot here at Shadowversity. I mean, a little under 6 foot. We're all about roughly the same size. If you ask the ladies, we're 6 foot. But you can see roughly then how tall these swords are to us. And these are, yes, we know this is a witch sword, but these are all roughly accurate.
Yeah.
Even if we take a look at, I think this one over here is where we start to get a little bigger. So let's leave that for just the moment.
The next comparison to this kind of size sword is there are some Asian equivalents. And so there is a crossover and also some range of sizing here, okay? Because the tachi or o-katana is larger than a katana. They don't usually reach this size, okay? When you get to this size, you're going to get into what is called the odachi or nodachi right here.
Which you definitely need to sheath and unsheath comfortably. You need a second person. You can do it yourself. But
this is actually a bit longer than probably. Let's take them out and compare sizes. Men like to compare sizes.
I mean, only if they win do they like.
Yeah,
it's a little tall,
tiny,
not by much.
but nowhere near as exaggerated as when they're in their sheaths.
No,
these are actually quite equivalent.
When you put them blade to blade tip, it's a little more again.
Yeah.
they made a ting. It's a little more again, but
they're very close. Very
yes,
close.
Very,
We're
very
talking
close.
about like an inch difference,
Yeah,
right?
and historically speaking, that means they would have wavered a little, and you might have got ones where the Claymore was bigger, or the war sword was bigger, and
Exactly,
the odachi was down.
And so,
Oh, this is always so scary.
when people think of the nodachi, right, they often think of that as like the Asian or Japanese, more specifically, equivalent to the great sword.
Yep.
When actually, not necessarily. It's more the equivalent to the war sword, where the actual great sword, if you want to grab our prop, because I do intend to get one eventually. They're just hard to find at an affordable price. They're expensive.
Okay, it's a little...
Actual great sword is that these are the big boys.
Now that is, I would call that a little thin. It almost looks like it's got a shield. So
Well, it has a ricasso, and a lot of classic great swords did have ricassos, depending on the type. But we'll talk a bit about the great swords in a second. We want to talk about the nodachi. So we're still in kind of the war sword range at the moment, this size range, and the use cases for these size swords is interesting. They're like, these ones were used for warfare. Okay, that's hence it was called war sword.
it's not something you just put on your belt to carry as self-defense.
Yes, these are not really self-defense swords. Now, this the nodachi, it was used for warfare, but they distinctly kind of consider it an anti-cavalry sword.
Because it is anti-horse.
Yes.
So the equivalent, because in today's modern military, we have anti-personnel rifles, things designed to put holes in people, and anti-material rifles, things designed to put holes in things.
So
This sounds like an anti-thing sword.
I have my doubts about that, and I could be wrong. It could, because we have tested this nodachi, and they are difficult to cut with. Quite difficult to cut with. And in fact, far more difficult than...
A big, heavy, straight blade.
Okay, this is an incredible cutting sword. We've tested this one out, and it's the Honshu Claymore, I believe. We have an affiliate link for Honshu. You can check that out on the thing. Brilliant sword. And so in terms of their usability, it's kind of night and day. And even though the nodachi had some, like aesthetic defects as well that we weren't happy with, we were testing out just how well this shape of sword handles. And we can extrapolate that to other swords of similar size and shape and stuff. And we were surprised at how awful the edge alignment is for a curved sword of that size.
But we found out why, because it is a curved sword of this size.
It is a curved sword of that size. Now, if you're attacking a horse, what would be one of the primary angles of attack, you would think?
You would think down towards the neck.
Really? Because
I would think.
if it's to take out a horse...
So that's a defense. I wouldn't call that necessarily an attack towards a horse. It is a defensive stance, ready for a horse to run upon it. But I see what you mean, but I wouldn't call that attacking a horse.
To me, when you think an anti-cavalry sword, if you're in the intent to
bracing.
take a horse, you wouldn't brace. Like,
Yeah, you would brace.
That's mainly a chopping
I
weapon.
would brace.
They'd use a spear. Like, that's for chopping. And so you would think that one of the main attacks is a sideways attack at the chest or legs, which I would think is suicide.
Yeah, I still think a downwards chop because you
right.
want more power. But I see what you mean.
The nodachi would do well in downwards chops. That's where edge alignment isn't as much of an issue. It's when you get more complex chops as well as sideways ones where it really is a mess. Okay.
Yep.
And if it's an anti-cavalry sword, I would say it wasn't necessarily to take out the horse, and I could be wrong about that, because I don't think you could chop off legs with that sword. We've tried it. It's just so bad at cutting, you're not going to get through a leg. Like, we can extrapolate this, okay? This one might have a chance because it's really good at cutting.
It probably would have a good chance.
But I think horse bones are thick.
Yes.
So even if you couldn't chop through a leg, a serious gash on the shin or leg of a horse might cause it to fall over anyway. And if that's the case, then yeah, definitely that could still be considered an anti-cavalry sword.
I still think it would be overkill for what's needed, but I understand why.
But before we continue, there's a question about giant swords. Because there's a range of sizes that fall into two extremes, and it's the extremes I want to just bring up a bit here, okay? Where you have, like, I think this is a moderate kind of sized giant sword.
Fair enough.
But then you have a
Super
giant
wide.
sword like this.
Yeah.
Where they get really thick.
It's a table.
But that's one extreme. The other extreme is when they get really, really, really long.
So what you're saying is in giant swords you have the long boy.
Long boy.
And the fat boy?
And the thick boy.
The thick boy.
Long boy and the thick boy.
Ugh.
I want to know which one we think is best, but that is a discussion for our exclusive content. And so for our supporters, and you can support us through channel memberships on YouTube, Patreon, Subscribestar, or Player, $1 to $5 a month. You can check out. You got a fly, you get it?
Yeah.
It's pretty nimble, that, isn't it? That might be part of the discussion. We're going to discuss which is better, long or thick. And genuinely, it's only thanks to our supporters we're able to keep making content. So thank you to everyone who is, and we're able to give back these exclusive videos for you. And there's a whole range of exclusive videos.
There are.
Really fun ones, okay? That you start to miss out on great content, and it's only $1 to $5 a month, really affordable, and they're going to give back to you. So thank you to everyone for supporting us. And let's get back to the actual great swords, the huge swords, the giant swords.
The real historical one, because there's some interesting facts we haven't covered yet.
From history. There is a Chinese equivalent of the odachi.
Really? Now this
Yes.
I don't know.
So the translation is a bit tricky because the Japanese pronunciation of these characters is Zanbato. And when you look up Zanbato, you will often see just nodachis, where Zanbato is actually the name of a Chinese sword of about equivalent size. They're a bit straighter, usually sometimes have a more flared tip, but they have a curve at the end.
Okay.
And one of the pronunciations, I think, is Janbado, sorry, something like that. Ow! Jian is one of the Chinese names for sword, and it's like Janbato.
Okay. So it's like odachi, basically.
Basically.
In a way,
yeah,
in a way.
Yeah. Now, some people have latched on and considered the Zanbato to be an even bigger version of the nodachi, when it's actually, it's about equivalent size of the nodachi, and it's just the Chinese version of it. Was an earlier kind of period sword, looking at like 1200s, I think, for the Zanbato or Janbado.
See, I don't know. This is outside my normal wheelhouse.
Yeah, a really interesting sword, okay? I have not seen many cases of swords that are bigger than that in Asia, all right, that reaches great sword size.
And the great swords can get bigger again. Like you'll see them over the height of a human.
This high, sometimes a bit shorter, but there's a range. And these are the big boys. And interesting enough, pretty close to some of the sizes of giant swords.
Yep, and that makes sense.
They're just made more elegantly with a more refined weight distribution to be functional still. And I'll get my hands on a real one someday.
You know, something that I do like about swords of this height, if I can grab this one, is the way they're used and what they're used for. So war swords, don't get me wrong, you can still get big people, strong people swinging them, one-handed, two-handed, usually two-handed you would imagine. But these, when they're used for crowd control, you just keep helicoptering the blade. And to get them going fast enough, a lot of things have a kick. It is so elegant. I think it's the montante. It's a thing.
Maybe. I think it's more style. I think if you really wanted, like, because I have held real grey swords, and yeah, you can just, let's go.
You absolutely can. You absolutely can. But it is a real thing. It's written in the manuals.
I know it's real. Yeah. But
I just think it's cool.
Sometimes there are things in manual that are more style over substance, like throwing pummels.
That's another debate we will get to. We actually
Am I wrong?
We got to in a previous video. We've done this, I think even in the last year we've done another one on this. But there are, when it comes to swords like this, there are a lot more examples than the great sword or the Zweihander. There's the montante, there is
that's what I want to get to, because let's break those down, right?
Sure.
Because great sword is not a name for a specific sword. It's an umbrella term for a group of swords.
Yes.
And they have different names in different periods. Sometimes they were just called two-handed swords.
Yes. And we're talking late medieval, early Renaissance, even mid-Renaissance sometimes.
There are examples of really big, long swords that are even approaching this size, right? That are in the medieval period, which is still kind of, you know,
Executioner's sword,
the 15th century.
Because that's a big sword. It's a big, heavy sword designed to just clear through necks.
It is thick, but it's not long. An executioner sword is shorter than this. They actually cut off about where my foot is.
I swear I've seen artwork where it is closer to about here, though in medieval times people were a little shorter, so it could be that.
I'm not saying there weren't examples that were longer, just the stereotypical
Generally.
surviving examples
Okay.
that I've seen are shorter, but they're heavy and thick. They're like axes, basically.
Which is exactly what they're designed to do. You take off a head.
Yes. So, great sword. We have the Zweihander, which
German.
is German for two-hander.
Yes.
We have two-handed sword, which is English for two-handed sword.
Yes, that's true.
Then there is the Montante, which is more Spanish. And you know that you've seen Montante, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So Montantes are usually have a nice big ricasso. They have the flanges or lugs there.
Which always sounds like a very tasty cheese.
Yeah.
But-
and usually very thin and elegant as
Yes,
well.
they are indeed. And then there's also, don't forget, the flamberge, which was
flamberge.
one of the ones that we've got documented a lot being used throughout battlefield history to take on pikes.
And the flamberge is stereotypically identified by a wavy blade.
Yes, the flame blade, the flamberge.
The flamberge.
So-
Which is also interesting because there are shorter flamberge blades that were called flamberge because of the wave on them, but in
And
the
I've-
modern day, they more stereotypically now identify the big flamberge.
And I have seen people, how accurate this is, I don't know, but I have seen people who categorise something like a Montante as a flamberge. So they're categorising flamberge, even though it's not flame blade, as a size of great sword.
Yes.
So it's a very grey area when we start to talk about this.
There might be one that we're missing, but there's a category of swords, and they usually identify different in culture. Where a lot of these swords, like if you got a Montante and took it to Germany, it would be a Zweihander.
Zweihander. Yeah.
Though there are some stylistic, or what I've seen, Zweihanders don't like. When you look up the historical surviving examples, a lot of the Zweihanders don't have a taper. They're thin, but they don't have a taper.
Oh.
Where Montantes, you can see a distinct taper on the blade.
Okay.
Meaning it gets thinner towards the tip. There are even some Zweihanders that get a tiny bit thicker at the tip. They're straight and they get a little bit thicker.
That sounds unwieldy.
It's barely, you look, it's there, but it's not very pronounced.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, no, and so there are some differences with region and style there, but they would probably just call it, it's a big two-handed sword.
Yeah.
And they're kind of descriptive terms originally that have now been adopted to. Zweihander is an interesting term because it's two-handed.
Yes.
And so it can sometimes be applied to long swords.
That's a two-handed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
war swords as well.
Funny thing is,
Stereotypically, when you look up Zweihander, you're going to get great swords, but originally, there's just like long swords. That's a two-handed sword.
yeah, and I remember speaking about this more from a D&D point of view, but I remember back in the days when I played a lot of D&D, we'd call something you could only hold in one hand or comfortably in one hand, a one-handed sword. If there was more room, you'd call it a two-handed sword. If you could put your hand on the blade, you'd call it a three-handed sword because you would make sense to have, I know you can definitely fit more than three hands. You call it a three-handed sword and it almost starts to become more like a spear. So it's interesting how different people from different classifications can start to classify these things.
Yes.
I still think that is amazing.
It's got style.
It has so much style.
So these are the big actual giant swords from history, but there is a bigger one. We will get there. First, let's talk about utility and uses. We do not have accounts of these being anti-cavalry swords.
Not that I can recall.
They could be used against people on horseback, but usually if you're facing, people on horseback, spear, pikes and things.
Oh yeah, but if all you had was that, then that makes sense.
But it's the pikes where this comes into discussion.
For the flamberge, yes. Now there's been a bit of debate as to whether the waviness was used to serrate the pikes or whether it was just used that as the pikes come in, because if you've ever seen a lot of pikes, it gets really messy, just to create a lot of coverage.
But also knock aside.
Knock aside, but if you have pikes coming under, create a lot of upper coverage and a few things like that. What's interesting and what has been proven is how much these guys got paid. I think it was twice, or 2.5
It's like
times,
hazard pay. They're on the front line and they got paid more.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Landsknecht here specifically. They're a stereotypical, very in art, they're often depicted wearing very bright, fancy clothing.
Big sort of
puffy
shoulders with lots of gorgeous looking.
Big swords.
Yes.
And they can, and sometimes, because that's the thing, not all great swords were this thin. We see artwork of some being pretty thick, and that would be heavier. They'd be chunky,
very heavy.
And they got weight behind it. They'd have power. And so one of the theories is that these were made to either knock aside or break up pike formations. That is speculation, and there is debate about that.
And there's also artwork that kind of shows that as well, but that artwork can be translated, if you want to put it that way, in a lot of different ways. So hence there being a lot of debate about that. With something that there isn't necessarily a lot of debate about is one of the manuals. I think it's on Montante, because that is crowd control.
Crowd control.
It's designed. You have a print. I think it's Montante. I could be wrong. I'm hoping I'm not.
I think it's Montante. Montante has a lot of this
big flowing. So
movements.
if you're trying to protect someone like a princess, for example, it is how to guard them.
Yes.
A noble woman. How to guard them from a lot of people to keep them away. And there's a lot of big dynamic movement. So it's not you're in a formation anymore. It is completely changed to you have a big open area and you're doing crowd control.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how these were used.
Really interesting. And so they absolutely were used in history. And we have actually a couple more accounts of kind of defining use cases, even more than the odachi. And so this is the thing though. This isn't the biggest sword, European sword in history. There is a bigger sword. And people misunderstand this sword. It's called a bearing sword.
Yes, I was racking my brain for a moment to figure out exactly what he meant. A bearing sword, that is correct. Now, if we take a look at something like a bearing sword.
We basically got two. And this is the thing. People look at these fantasy giant swords, right? And they think, well, they're just ridiculous. There was never anything in history that would be equivalent to this size.
Now, in warfare and in battle, that's pretty right.
But in actual real historical counterparts, there are historical swords that are legitimately this big.
Yep.
Sometimes bigger.
Yep.
And they are called bearing swords. They look like giant long swords. They are European big swords, okay?
The whole thing of it was literally, it's just, you're bearing it on your shoulder. I don't know the exact etymology, you're bearing it on your shoulder. It is a display piece.
It is a sword to be borne, usually on festivals and for display. It is a sword, it is a bearing sword, a sword to be borne, to be presented, and people have actually tried to, there's a false notion that some of these bearing swords in the museum, they have tried to say this is actually a sword of this historical figure who was 7 foot tall and it was his sword. That's false. It's not true, okay? And I could probably look up his name, but at the moment it escapes me, but that is incorrect. No, bearing swords are ceremonial swords.
Yes.
That were made to kind of either show the wealth of a town, look at, our craftsmen, what we can make, or the prestige item for a guild, and when there were festivals, or if the guild wanted to show off, and
down the street.
They would grab the bearing sword to be borne, and they would, at the head of the festival or proceeding, check out this giant friggin' sword and how great we are.
You gotta imagine you're looking down the street and you can see like this sword twice the height of a person, because it's obviously being held at that height. You'd probably go and check out that parade. Yeah. You'd probably go and take a look.
Yeah. And this thing, to my understanding, the swords were still made functional.
Yeah.
They were real swords.
It's just that humans have their limits.
Just too big that you would be able to use them. But that's the reality. Like, if you did have a sword this big, unless you had superhuman strength, you wouldn't be able to use them. It doesn't mean no one ever made them.
No, it doesn't mean there's not a lot of stories that have generated off from that, which may give rise to some of the William Wallace carried a sword 5 times his height.
But this is the thing. People like giant swords.
They do.
In actual fact, they've liked them all throughout most of history. Where swords have been around, there's been people thinking, what if we made it bigger? And there we go. There are actual real giant historical swords in a varying range of sizes, even really big ones.
Really big ones.
And you know what I kind of like about, well, I wish this would happen, right? They should be adopted in fantasy.
For their actual use?
For their use. Because fantasy have superhuman adventures and stuff like that. Bearing sword should unironically be a category of sword in fantasy. D&D, role-playing, all that stuff.
I can see that.
And it annoys me because we see certain huge swords in video games and stuff, and I'm looking at Elden Ring in this example, and they're this big. But then they make them, they grab the design of like a Zweihander, right? And just make it way too big.
Yep, just scale.
And then they're swinging this thing around like they can barely lift it. And it frustrates me because that's not what Zweihanders were like.
No.
But if you had a bearing sword level Zweihander,
that kind of starts to make sense.
That fits. And so there should be, just great sword should be a functional category. Don't go overboard. But as soon as they want to go overboard,
bearing sword.
Bearing sword is the actual category of that size sword.
I can see someone in a video game making a bearing sword out of bearings. Now,
because this is the thing, right? If you could actually lift a giant sword,
yep.
I reckon that would be useful in combat.
Yes.
We've actually tested this.
Well, yes, we have.
And the video's right there where we make some foam giant swords, and it was like either the swords are made out of a super material that's really light, or we're super strong. How useful would they be in combat? And they're useful.
That was fun.
That was heaps of fun. Check it out video. It's right there. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in that video. Oh, have fun. Check it out.
I'm gonna go chop something.